On June 12, 2025, the world was jolted awake by news of a massive Israeli military operation against Iran. The early morning hours were filled with confusion and fear as reports poured in from across the globe, each more alarming than the last. For many, it was a moment that felt both shocking and inevitable, the culmination of years of rising tensions and dire warnings. Israel's Operation Rising Lion unleashed powerful airstrikes on over 60 sites, including key locations in Tehran, targeting Iran's military and nuclear infrastructure with precision and force. The operation was meticulously planned, involving dozens of fighter jets, advanced drones, and electronic warfare units. Explosions lit up the night sky, and satellite images soon revealed plumes of smoke rising from some of Iran's most sensitive facilities. The attack marked a dramatic escalation, ending years of warnings and failed diplomacy. It was a turning point that shattered any remaining illusions of stability in the region, as the world watched in real time. Israeli leaders had long warned they would not allow Iran to acquire nuclear weapons, and this was their high-stakes gamble. In press conferences and behind closed doors, they had insisted that action was necessary to prevent what they saw as an existential threat. Now, their words had become reality, and the world was left to grapple with the consequences. The aftermath was chaotic. Destroyed buildings, casualties, and fear gripped both nations. Emergency crews rushed to the scenes of devastation, searching for survivors amid the rubble. Civilians, caught in the crossfire, faced uncertainty and terror as sirens wailed and the threat of further violence loomed. Iran condemned the attack and vowed swift retaliation, while Israelis braced for incoming strikes. Both governments placed their militaries on high alert, and ordinary people on both sides prepared for the worst, seeking shelter and anxiously awaiting the next move. The world watched as the shadow war between Israel and Iran erupted into open conflict, forever altering the region's political landscape. News outlets broadcast live updates, and millions followed the unfolding crisis, aware that its impact would be felt far beyond the Middle East. This story explores the fears, decisions, and global reactions that led to this point of no return. Leaders from around the world scrambled to respond, holding emergency meetings and issuing urgent calls for restraint, but the momentum of conflict seemed unstoppable. Failed diplomatic efforts and repeated clashes had brought both countries to the brink. Years of negotiations, sanctions, and back-channel talks had ultimately collapsed, replaced by open hostility and the grim reality of war. Protesters took to the streets in cities worldwide, demanding peace and fearing escalation. The June 12th attack shattered the fragile peace, leaving the world to wonder what would come next. Streets emptied as people stayed indoors, glued to their screens, searching for answers and hoping for safety in a world suddenly changed. The Middle East had entered a new, dangerous era, one defined by uncertainty, fear, and the ever-present risk of further escalation. The consequences of this single night would ripple across the globe for years to come. At the heart of Israel's decision was a single, overriding fear: Iran's nuclear program. Israeli leaders, including Prime Minister Netanyahu, saw a nuclear-armed Iran as an existential threat. They believed Iran was on the verge of building a bomb, and that waiting any longer would make it unstoppable. This urgency was shared across Israel's security establishment, who saw a closing window to act. Iran insisted its nuclear program was peaceful, but Israel and many Western nations remained deeply skeptical. Years of secrecy and limited cooperation with inspectors fueled distrust. Israeli intelligence claimed Iran had enough enriched uranium for several bombs, driving the sense of a ticking clock. The strike was framed as self-defense, a last chance to prevent a catastrophic future. For Israel, the risk of inaction outweighed the dangers of war. The final trigger for Israel's attack was a damning report from the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IEA. For years, the world had watched Iran's nuclear program with growing unease, but this report marked a turning point that could not be ignored. In early June 2025, the IEA declared Iran in breach of its non-proliferation obligations for the first time in 2 decades. The announcement sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles and global capitals alike, as the world realized the gravity of the situation. The report revealed that Iran had amassed enough 60% enriched uranium to potentially build 9 nuclear bombs, an alarming acceleration that far exceeded previous estimates. Experts warned that this level of enrichment brought Iran dangerously close to weapons-grade material. For many, This was not just a technical violation, but a signal that Iran's nuclear ambitions had reached a critical threshold. The international community was forced to confront the possibility that Iran could become a nuclear-armed state in a matter of months, not years. Diplomatic talks had stalled, and the IAEA's findings left few peaceful options on the table. Negotiators who had spent years seeking compromise now faced a dead end, as trust between Iran and the West evaporated. Israeli officials seized on the report, arguing that sanctions and negotiations had failed to halt Iran's progress. They insisted that the world could no longer afford to wait and hope for a diplomatic breakthrough. The IAEA's chief warned that inspectors could no longer monitor Iran's nuclear sites, creating a dangerous information vacuum. Without access, the world was left in the dark about Iran's true capabilities and intentions. No one knew exactly where Iran's uranium was stored or how close it was to weaponization. The lack of transparency heightened global anxiety and made it nearly impossible to assess the real threat. This uncertainty fueled Israeli fears and justified immediate action. Military leaders argued that waiting any longer could mean missing the last window to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran. The combination of a large uranium stockpile, Iran's non-compliance, and the sudden lack of oversight created a perfect storm. The risk of miscalculation or surprise attack was higher than ever. For Israel, the time for waiting was over. The government concluded that decisive action was the only way to ensure its security and prevent a nuclear crisis from spiraling out of control. The world now faced a nuclear crisis with no clear solution, as leaders scrambled to respond to a rapidly escalating threat that could reshape the balance of power in the Middle East and beyond. Israel's attack was also driven by fears of Iran's regional influence. Iran's network of proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the Houthis, formed a ring of fire around Israel. These groups, armed and funded by Tehran, could strike Israel from multiple fronts. The June strikes aimed not only at nuclear sites but also at crippling Iran's ability to support its proxies. By targeting Iran's military leadership and command centers, Israel hoped to disrupt this network. The goal: weaken Iran's regional power and change the rules of the game. The conflict was now about more than nuclear weapons. It was about the entire balance of power in the Middle East. Operation Rising Lion targeted Iran's nuclear and military infrastructure with precision. Key sites hit included the Natanz enrichment facility, centrifuge workshops near Tehran, and missile production factories. The IAEA confirmed major damage to Iran's centrifuge sites. Israeli strikes also targeted missile launchers to blunt Iran's ability to retaliate. High-ranking Iranian leaders, including IRGC commander Hossein Salami and nuclear scientist Faridun Abbasi, were killed. The operation even struck Iran's internal security headquarters, aiming to destabilize the regime from within. Israel's strategy was comprehensive: dismantle nuclear capabilities, degrade military power, and undermine internal control. The attack was a bold attempt to deliver a crippling blow on every front. Iran's response would soon show just how high the stakes had become. Iran's retaliation was immediate and massive. Operation True Promise 3 saw Iran launch around 400 missiles and hundreds of drones at Israeli cities and military sites. The barrage overwhelmed defenses, causing significant casualties and damage, at least 24 killed, many more injured. Israeli air defense systems intercepted most projectiles, but the sheer volume exposed their limits. Iran's attack demonstrated new military sophistication and resolve. Iranian leaders declared their nuclear program would continue, undeterred. The conflict had become a deadly, two-sided war, with no easy end in sight. The world's reaction was swift but deeply divided. The US, initially distancing itself, soon demanded Iran's surrender and considered direct military action. Some European leaders backed Israel, while others urged restraint and a return to diplomacy. Russia and China condemned the Israeli attack, warning against further escalation and US involvement. The United Nations failed to reach consensus, leaving both nations to face off largely alone. Iran's supreme leader rejected US ultimatums, vowing to resist. The conflict became a proxy battleground for global powers. With no unified response, the risk of wider war grew by the day. Amid the relentless military strikes, it was the civilians in both countries who paid the highest price. Everyday life was shattered in an instant, as ordinary people found themselves trapped in the chaos of war. In Iran, over 585 people lost their lives, including 239 civilians, as airstrikes tore through neighborhoods, leaving devastation in their wake. Thousands were forced to abandon their homes, carrying only what they could, as entire communities were uprooted overnight. Essential services collapsed under the strain. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded, while widespread internet blackouts left families cut off from loved ones. With power outages and empty shelves, daily life ground to a halt, replaced by uncertainty and fear. In Israel, Iranian missile attacks killed at least 24 people and left cities like Tel Aviv and Haifa scarred and shaken. The destruction was visible on every street, as once bustling neighborhoods became scenes of devastation. Air raid sirens and bomb shelters became part of daily life. Schools closed their doors, playgrounds fell silent, and businesses shuttered, leaving families to navigate a new reality defined by constant threat. The psychological toll was immense, especially on children, who lived in constant fear and confusion. Many struggled to sleep, haunted by the sounds of explosions and the uncertainty of what tomorrow might bring. The war turned daily routines into life-or-death decisions. Simple acts like going to the market or sending children to school became fraught with danger, as everyone adapted to a world turned upside down. Both societies faced mounting economic hardship, trauma, and a deep sense of uncertainty about the future. Jobs vanished, savings dwindled, and the struggle to find basic necessities became a daily challenge. For civilians, the conflict was never about politics or power. It was about survival. Every day was a test of resilience, as families did whatever they could to protect each other. The human cost was the most tragic consequence of this escalating war. Behind every statistic was a story of loss, heartbreak, and lives forever changed. Ordinary people bore the brunt of decisions made far above their heads, enduring hardship and heartbreak as they waited and hoped for peace to return. The Israeli-Iranian war has plunged the Middle East into its gravest crisis in decades. What began as a preemptive strike has become a direct, open-ended conflict with no clear exit. Hundreds are dead, thousands wounded, and the region's fragile order is shattered. Global powers are divided, turning the conflict into a dangerous proxy standoff. The fate of Iran's nuclear program remains uncertain, with no inspectors on the ground. Diplomacy seems distant, and the risk of wider war looms large. The rules of engagement have changed, and the threshold for direct confrontation has been crossed. Lasting peace will require a fundamental rethinking of regional security. Until then, millions face a future defined by fear, instability, and the unknown.